Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of the Jones Point Navigator series. It's designed to help companies navigate shifting policy trends from DC. I'm Tommy Barletta. I'm the founder and CEO of Jones Point. Today, we'll be focusing on the FTC's recent proposed rule around banning non-compete agreements. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the folks over at Angel MD for partnering with us on this episode. As some of you may know, Angel MD is a network of over 35,000 physicians and startups focused on innovation in healthcare. And given the focus of today's conversation and some of the impact on physicians and their practices, it's a great partnership to have. So we thank them for that. Now let's turn to the substance of today's discussion. On January 5th, the FTC moved forward with a proposed rule to ban non-compete arrangements. It has pretty widespread implications across the kind of U.S. economy. It's something that the Biden administration had signaled since President Biden was elected, and they finally moved forward with it at the start of this year. Specific to healthcare, given the structure of healthcare systems, physician practices, changing in the structure and the legality of non-compete agreements could have some profound material impacts. So joining us today to discuss the proposal, the impact, the potential that it becomes law, we're pleased to be joined by Gus Sandstrom, a partner at Blank Rome LLP. He works out of their Philly and Washington, D.C. offices. He's a lawyer focused on employment law and ERISA and has extensive labor litigation experience. Gus, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Great to be here, Tommy. Thank you for having me.
Great. Well, Gus, before we talk about the proposal, I think it's important to set a baseline for folks about what the status quo is, where we are currently from a non-compete regulation perspective. I know leading up to this conversation when we spoke, you flagged there's some differences between kind of the current lack of federal protections and what's going on in some of the states. So I'd love to start there, get your kind of lay of the land, and then we can delve into what the FTC has proposed and what the ultimate impacts are for the healthcare system.
So certainly, Tommy, and I agree that's a good starting point. We are at a point in time right now where there's been extraordinary growth in the expansion in the use of non-compete and similar agreements by employers. Not that long ago, when one saw these agreements, they were typically restricted to higher level executives and managers, and often at bigger entities. Over the past 10 or so years, that has expanded downward such that it's harder to find an employee who is not subject to some restriction than it is to find an employee who is. And that growth has led as a reaction to also increasing state level regulation of non-competes and restriction. Many may know that certain states like California essentially ban non-competes and have for a long time. But in the past few years, an ever-growing number of states, including states that one wouldn't think off the top of one's head as being strong regulators of these types of agreements, have passed legislation either banning non-competition agreements or significantly limiting the scope of employees to whom they can be applied. So while in most states, there's still great freedom for employers to enter into restrictive covenant agreements with employees, the pendulum is certainly swinging towards regulation. And to jump ahead, this attempt by the FTC to put out essentially an all-out ban is, it's sort of the logical extreme of the swing of the pendulum.
Great, Gus. Thanks so much. Now, one of the things you mentioned is how the use case of these is kind of penetrating deeper in kind of across companies, deeper into companies, right? So you think about it in the healthcare system, is it the case that it's just physicians as well as nurses and kind of, I hate to say kind of lower tier, but deeper in within healthcare system? Is that the case as well?
That is absolutely the case. They're very common amongst physicians, and that goes everywhere from large, hospital, educational institutions, down through, small, handful of practitioner practices. Nurses relatively common, and amongst the larger hospital groups, you do see them flowing down to assistants and other employees who you wouldn't necessarily see as the skilled workers who would traditionally be subject to a non-competition restriction. But if you think about it, the value that these entities see in the non-compete and similar restrictions, it's protecting their own assets. A key asset is the goodwill, the relationships, right? If a doctor leaves, if a nurse leaves who has close relationships, and those patients takes them with them, that's a huge financial impact. So it's easy to understand the desire to regulate, just as it's also easy to see the desire to restrict, just as it's also easy to see at the state level and now on the federal level, the desire to regulate.
And that's a good point, especially on the value that you just made. I think as we've seen an increasing amount of consolidation across the healthcare universe, and again, that's a subject for a whole other FTC related discussion. I think it gets to the value of, for the acquirer or a target are the relationships there. So that's a really good point there. So let's move on to what the FTC did on January 5th. It was certainly interesting, and I'd love to kind of start with your broad strokes of the proposal, what it might mean for healthcare, and then I have some questions along the way.
So certainly, Tommy, as you flagged at the start, one of the Biden administration's stated objectives was to increase regulation in this space. And the FTC has been on a very aggressive streak of trying to limit restrictions on competition. They've taken a number of steps in transactions to try and use antitrust laws to limit restrictions up to now. The current proposed rule is unbelievably broad. Taken on its face, it not only applies to non-compete agreements going forward, it has an all-out ban on the enforcement and continuation of existing agreements with employees. So traditionally, when new regulation comes in, things that you did before the regulation are grandfathered and aren't impacted. Here, the rule would require employers to affirmatively void all existing non-competes, notify the employees that they are voided. And then, as we said, ban them going forward. And then, it's not just that there's a ban on non-competes. The definition of what the FTC considers a non-compete for purposes of the rule goes beyond just a traditional non-competition or restrictive covenant agreement. It also goes to policies that might restrict future competition, limits in equity and incentive payments. For example, a partnership like a medical practice might often condition the payout of someone's equity share when they leave on non-competition for a certain period of time. That, under a plain language reading of the FTC rule, would similarly be banned. And there are restrictions even on non-competes in M&A and acquisition transactions, which traditionally have been an area where even states are far more liberal in permitting non-competes. Going back to the whole goodwill, part of the value of what you're acquiring is having the people who are part of the entity. The FTC rule would still has a carve out for certain equity-based transactions and non-competes there, but it's far more limited than any state law currently has in place. So the rule is not yet in effect. There's a 60-day comment period that runs through March 6th. The FTC may modify the rule based on comment, but assuming there are no modifications, it could go into effect as early as March 6th.
Great. Thanks so much. A couple questions about the rule, and we can talk about kind of implications. So are there any exemptions, any kind of things that the FTC noted that this wouldn't cover? Although I do note that you did say it was unbelievably broad, but anything that that they said would be carved out in this approach?
Yeah. So two things. First of all, the FTC's jurisdiction only relates to entities that it has the power to regulate. One significant exception there is nonprofit entities. The FTC is not able to regulate or doesn't have the authority to regulate most nonprofits. That's relevant in the healthcare space because many of the larger hospital groups that are associated with educational institutions are nonprofits. Two, as I mentioned, there's this carve out for certain equity transactions. Generally speaking, if someone is a 25% or greater owner and they are engaging or part of a buyout or equity transaction, a non-compete still could be used in connection with that purchase.
Great. And then as part of the discussion, it seemed like from my reading, the FTC was at least open to some alternative approaches as they think about going from proposed to final. Any thoughts on those kind of conversations and approaches?
Sure. And as one can imagine, there is and will continue to be a very strong pressure operation placed on the FTC. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for example, has come out firmly against this. And many pro-business side lobbying and trade groups are pushing against it. There will likely be a step back. The FTC has said it was open to, I think, going down to 10% on the equity side. So if the final rule may be as low as a 10% equity owner could be subject to a non-compete in a transaction. I think it's very possible there will be some scaling back of the scope. I mentioned previously, the scope right now is really broad and goes beyond just traditional agreements. I think there'll be some wearing away at the edges there as to what types of agreements this actually applies to. That being said, the FTC and more broadly the Biden administration is dead set on trying to put some restriction in place. And I don't see there being a likelihood of any significant changes to the core non-compete ban that's going to be part of this proposed rule. I think we can safely assume that will go into effect. We can also safely assume it's going to be challenged.
Right, which is a great lead into my next question. So comments close in March. I'm sure they'll take some time to consider them and respond to every one of them as they want to do. And then they'll put some, a final rule out there. I think the general viewpoint across all of healthcare, and this probably is across other sectors, is the proposed is always scarier than the final because that's just how things go. So assuming they finalize a lighter version of this, let's talk about, the next steps, litigation, how you see, at least from a timing perspective. And sure. I guess the most important issue would be is whether they, basically don't have to enforce it, or if there's a, the court puts an injunction on them. So
there are few certainties in life. There is nearly a 100% certainty that the day this rule goes into effect, somebody will go into court and seek an injunction or a temporary restraining order against the rule. The U.S. Chamber has already indicated it will do it. There are going to be other employer groups that do it. And litigation against government action has become a very strategic and refined industry in recent years, both with respect to attempts to stop Trump administration regulations and with respect to, for example, the COVID vaccine and testing regulations that the Biden administration put into effect a few years ago. The groups that challenge these rules, pick their courts carefully. And even though the judge you are assigned in a court is random, there are plenty of federal courts out there that have Republican appointee majorities and strong majorities amongst their judges. And for better or for worse, it's very easy to handicap based on whether a judge is a Republican or Democrat appointee, how they're going to come out on an issue like this. I think the odds of getting a nationwide injunction against this rule are extremely high. And that injunction will likely come very quickly after the rule goes into place. It's hard to predict what the FTC will do in the interim. I also think it is unlikely that they will take any steps to enforce or apply the rule, pending the initial set of challenges, because it would create chaos if they tried to do something and then a few days later there was an injunction. The FTC knows this is coming, and they also know that there likely will be an injunction.
Perfect, thanks. And I guess the other question related to that is, assuming that your thesis is correct, which it does seem like that's the consensus. Does this, even if this never goes into effect, does it create an opportunity or a support for states that are considering these policies to move forward with them? And in some sense, is it a backdoor way of influencing state policy, and knowing that doesn't mean it never actually come to fruition on the federal level? That's kind of the end game here. So I'd be kind of curious your thoughts about what states who are looking at this, what lessons they might learn, and ultimately what they might mean for their policy making.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Tommy. The overwhelming majority of observers, I think, will say, and this is going out on a limb a little, the FTC regulation is not going to survive. It is a drastic expansion of the FTC's power, and it's fighting upstream against a court system that is, especially up to the Supreme Court, heavily stacked against expansive government power. That said,
So for the last section of the discussion here, I'd love to enter into a bit of a hypothetical conversation with you. But let's assume that there's some version of the FTC's proposal comes into effect. But it would be great is to get your opinion on almost like a real world example of what this means for physicians, physician practices, the physician practice management roll up strategy that has been such a hallmark of private equity and large hospital systems, as well as insurers like the Uniteds of the world. So, for example, in January, the Urology of Indiana, it's a 40 physician practice of urologists, was acquired by U.S. Urology Partners, which is a portfolio company of NMS Capital. Let's say that the FTC proposal comes into effect, or Indiana enacts some kind of stringent non-compete regulations as a result of it. Like, what does it mean for the transaction? What does it mean for physicians? I mean, we're trying to get at here is, for the Angel MD members out there who are in practice and are thinking about it getting acquired, what effect does something like this have, or this trend have, on the value of the transaction, the value of the practice, and the decision to move forward with such an offer?
Yeah, I think at the initial level, the real concern is that it would have a substantially detrimental value on the valuation of practices by potential buyers. If you think about the way that many medical practices work, the value is in the patient relationships with the physicians. And if you cannot ensure that the physicians, who are the value of the practice that you are acquiring, or part of the synergies that you're looking to create, will stay with the practice for an extended period of time, or if they leave, that they can't go across the street and start up a competing practice and essentially take away a lot of the value that you've just bought, you have to discount against that as a buyer. It's happened in other industries in the past. It's happened in states where there are significant non-compete restrictions. And while the preservation of the ability to restrict the equity holders or certain equity holders in connection with the transaction mitigates that somewhat, many physician practices have layers beyond just the partners in the practice. There may be employee doctors. There may be partners whose equity share is small enough that it would not crossed the threshold for what's permissible under the proposed rule. And then, of course, there are many professional level employees, nurses, etc., who are not equity holders, who are not physicians, who themselves have a key role in the patient relationship. They may be the ones who the patients are actually dealing with primarily on a day-to-day basis. If none of those people can be restricted, if you're a buyer, you have to account for that risk in the value you're placing on a transaction. I'm not sure it would limit the number of transactions being proposed because the consolidation itself has extraordinary value, but it would impact the pricing and the amount that the partners in a practice could get out of a potential deal.
Interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, I think there are some other ways to drive value as part of those transactions, whether it's negotiating power, et cetera. But I think the decision by the physicians to do so, I think would be impacted there for sure. But I think based on what you've told us today, it seems like, from the FTC, well, at least what was proposed has a low likelihood of kind of coming into effect. But there may be some alternate approaches that, are interesting, or at least kind of move the conversation forward on the state level. Is that fair?
That is absolutely fair. I also think, irrespective of where regulation goes, the lawyers and the practices are very creative in figuring out ways to backdoor into protective restrictions as well. So no matter what happens, just as this has been in the case with state regulations, it's not as if it's the end of the game on ways to try and protect. It's just getting more and more creative in how you can do it through other types of, be it equity or financial type negative incentives, not to leave.
Gotcha. So it's almost a fighting the last war scenario we've got here with what the FTC is doing. Seems like
it's a great analogy. Yes.
Perfect. Well, Gus, thanks for the time today. Appreciate it. We'll put up your contact information at the end of this for folks who want to reach out directly to Gus and the team at Blank Rome to talk further about this if you have questions about what the FTC does. And I certainly would encourage folks to reach out to them once the FTC moves forward with a final rule. We may return to another conversation, Gus, to talk about what they've done since then and kind of implications and next steps. But thanks for your time, and I'll turn it to you for any kind of closing remarks here. But appreciate everything you gave us today.
Well, thank you again for having me today, Tommy. And I think continuing this conversation will likely be a good idea because, as we've discussed, this is far from the last step in this process. And it is really important for everyone who owns or is associated with the ownership of a medical practice or any other entity to stay on top of how the regulatory world is evolving at the federal, state, and local level, because it is very easy to walk your way into a trap and not have protections that you think you have and that you need. Structuring things well and staying a step ahead of the regulator has extraordinary value here.
And that's a great place to end. So thank you, Gus, and look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Same here, Tommy. Thank you.